Some stories you see don't start with a thunderclap. They begin with a quiet closing of a door, a long journey taken in silence. I want to tell you about one such story, about a woman named Tabitha Lund. She was 32 years old in the year of our Lord 1878, an age when many women were already mothers to grown children, and she was stepping onto a stagecoach in Ohio with her entire life packed into a single worn leather valise. She was heading west to Nevada, answering a notice for a ranch cook. It was a position, not a proposal, a wage, not a welcome. She expected nothing more. What she could not have known, as the coach lurched into motion, was that the man who had placed that notice, a rancher named Royce Hadley, was not looking for a cook so much as a ghost to fill an empty kitchen. He was a man who had boarded up the rooms of his own heart, and the cold reception waiting for Tabitha at the end of that dusty road was just the echo of his own desolate grief. But a kitchen, you understand, is a powerful place. It's a place of alchemy. And the home she would unknowingly build, the life she would find, would not begin with a promise, but with the simple, steady act of lighting a fire in a cold stove. Stay close, and maybe let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. This is a story for anyone who has ever had to start over. A story about how the loneliest work can sometimes build the most unexpected love. The air that met Tabitha when she stepped down from the stagecoach in Silver Creek, Nevada, was nothing like the damp, heavy air of an Ohio summer. It was thin, sharp, and so dry it seemed to pull the moisture right from her skin. It smelled of dust, hot pine, and the faint, metallic tang of the distant mines that gave the town its name. The town itself was little more than a single dusty street lined with raw timber buildings, their false fronts like hopeful promises against a vast, indifferent sky of searing blue. Horses hitched to rails flicked their tails at buzzing flies, and the groan of a wagon turning a corner was the loudest sound. She stood for a moment on the splintered planks of the platform, clutching the handle of her valise. It wasn't heavy, but it felt dense with the weight of all it contained. 2 simple calico dresses, her sewing kit, a small Bible, and nestled in the very center, wrapped in linen, her mother's wooden recipe box. That was all that was left. She wore her traveling dress of sturdy gray wool, sensible and plain, a bonnet tied neatly beneath her chin, protecting her face from the relentless sun. Her gaze was steady as she scanned the handful of men loitering near the station, looking for a face that matched the spare, functional lines of the advertisement she'd answered. A young man detached himself from the shade of the mercantile's overhang and ambled toward her. He was lanky, with a sun-weathered face and kind, tired eyes. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, you be Miss Lund?" "I am," she said, her voice clear and even. "Jedediah, Mr. Hadley sent me." He didn't offer to take her bag, just gestured with his head toward a buckboard wagon waiting down the street. "Ranch is a ways out. Best get started before the heat gets worse." Tabitha gave a single nod and followed him, her boots sinking slightly into the thick dust of the street. The ride out of town was conducted in a near-complete silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the jingle of the harness. Jed seemed disinclined to talk, and Tabitha was not a woman to force conversation. She watched the landscape unfold, a rugged, beautiful country of sagebrush and juniper, of stark rock formations and distant purple mountains that seemed to float on the horizon. It was a world away from the rolling green hills of her home, of what used to be her home. After nearly an hour, they turned onto a less traveled track that led toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley. The Hadley Ranch. It was larger than she'd expected, the corrals well mended, the barn sturdy. But the main house, a handsome 2-story structure built of river stone and timber, had a stillness about it that felt wrong. The windows were dark, the porch empty. It looked less like a home and more like a monument to one. Jed pulled the wagon to a halt near the bunkhouse, where a few men were mending tack in the shade. They looked up as she approached, their expressions curious but respectful. "Boss is over yonder," Jed said, pointing toward a man standing alone by the corral, his back to them. Tabitha took a steadying breath and walked toward him, her valise still in her hand. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn denim and a sweat-stained hat. He didn't turn until she was only a few feet away. When he did, she saw a face carved by sun and something harder. His eyes, a startling pale gray, were flat and distant. He looked at her, but it felt as though he were looking straight through her. This was Royce Hadley. "Miss Lund," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth. "Jed get you here all right?" "Yes, Mr. Hadley. The journey was fine." He gave a curt nod, his eyes flicking from her face to the valise in her hand, and back again. There was no welcome in his gaze, no flicker of interest. There was only a weary, profound indifference. "The notice was for a cook," he stated, as if she might have been confused about the purpose of her 1,000-mile journey. "The men eat at 6 in the morning and 6 at night. You'll prepare their meals. I leave a plate on the stove." He turned and began walking toward the silent house, expecting her to follow. "The kitchen's through here. Your room is off the back." He pushed open the heavy front door into a dim, cool entryway. A grand staircase swept upward into shadow. To the right, a large dining room was visible, the long table and chairs shrouded in white dustcloths, looking like a congregation of ghosts. He didn't even glance that way. He led her straight through to the back of the house, into the kitchen. It was a magnificent space, with a huge cast-iron stove, a large work table, and a dry sink with a pump, but it was coated in a fine layer of dust. The air was stale, smelling of disuse. It was a room that had been abandoned. "This is your domain," he said, the words utterly flat. He pointed to a narrow door at the far end of the room. "That's your quarters. Small, but it's private. Wages are $30 a month, paid on the 1st. Any questions?" His tone made it clear he hoped there were none. This was the rejection, she realized. Not a turning away, but a walling in. He was hiring her hands, her skill, but her presence was an intrusion he would tolerate, only as long as it remained invisible. He was treating her like a piece of equipment he'd ordered. She looked from his closed-off face to the dusty, silent kitchen. This was not a home she was entering. It was a workplace, and a cold one at that. She had come all this way to be a ghost in another person's house. "No questions, Mr. Hadley," she said, her voice betraying none of the chill that had settled deep in her bones. "I understand the terms." He seemed relieved by her lack of protest, by the business-like finality in her tone. He gave another one of his sharp, dismissive nods. "Bunkhouse will be looking for supper at 6. He turned without another word and walked out the back door, leaving her alone in the cavernous, silent kitchen. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Tabitha stood motionless for a long moment, the handle of her valise digging into her palm. The silence of the house pressed in. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, weighted quiet, full of things unsaid and undone. She had known this would not be easy. She had prepared herself for hardship, for loneliness, for the gruff manners of frontier men, but she hadn't prepared for this profound, erasing emptiness. Royce Hadley had not just shown her to her new place of work. He had shown her the precise, uncrossable boundaries of her existence on his ranch. She was to be a function, a pair of hands that produced meals. She was not to be a person. She set her valise down on the dusty floor. Her gaze swept the room again, taking in the tarnished copper pots hanging from a rack, the film of grime on the windows, the cold, black heart of the stove. Another woman might have wept. Another woman might have felt the sharp sting of humiliation, and turned right around, walked back to town, and used what little money she had to find passage anywhere else. But Tabitha Lund had spent the last year learning how to swallow tears and disappointment like dry bread. Her parents' farm, lost to the bank after the fever, took them both within a week. The small seamstress business she'd tried to start failed before it began. The slow, painful realization that there was nothing left for her in Ohio, no one to turn to. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she untied her bonnet and set it on the corner of the work table. She rolled up the sleeves of her gray dress. Her first act was not to inspect her own small room, or even to unpack her meager belongings. Her first act was to walk to the dry sink and work the handle of the pump. After a few dry, groaning coughs, water gushed out, cold and clear. She found a bucket and filled it. She found a tin of soap and a stack of rags tucked away in a cupboard, stiff with disuse, and she began to clean. She started with the stove, the heart of any kitchen. She scrubbed away the dust and grime, polishing the nickel trim until it gleamed faintly in the dim light. She opened the firebox, sweeping out the old, cold ash. She moved to the work table, her cloth moving in slow, steady circles, clearing away months, perhaps years, of accumulated neglect. The scent of lye soap and damp wood began to replace the stale air. This was the arrangement. He had drawn the lines, and she would honor them. But this space, this kitchen, was hers. He had given it to her, and she would make it right. Not for him, for herself. It was the only way she knew how to claim a piece of the world, by setting it in order. As she worked, the house remained silent. No footfalls from upstairs, no sounds from the main rooms. It was as if the rest of the building was holding its breath. Only the kitchen was slowly, painstakingly coming back to life under her hands. An hour before the men would be expecting their meal, she paused. She dried her hands on her apron, which she'd taken from her bag, and finally opened the valise all the way. She bypassed her clothes and lifted out the small, carved wooden box. She ran her fingers over the smooth, worn pine. Her father had made it for her mother on their first anniversary. Inside were dozens of handwritten cards, stained with flour and butter. The ink faded in places. Sarah's buttermilk biscuits. Mama's beef stew. Apple brown Betty. Tucked between the cards were pressed flowers and small penciled notes. Saw a robin today. John fixed the fence by the creek. It was a diary of a life, told in recipes. She set the box on the far corner of the now clean work table. It was a small, quiet declaration. This corner was hers. She was here. Then she selected a simple recipe for beans, bacon, and cornbread, and she began to cook. The smell of bacon frying, of cornmeal baking, soon filled the kitchen, a warm, living scent that pushed back against the house's cold silence. At 6 o'clock, she carried the heavy pots out to the bunkhouse, where the men received her with grateful nods. Back in the kitchen, she filled a single plate just as he'd instructed, and set it on the back of the stove to keep warm. Then she retired to her own small room to eat her portion alone, listening for the sound of the back door that would signal her employer had come for his supper. The days settled into a rhythm, as stark and steady as the landscape. Tabitha rose before the sun, the sky a pale, soft gray outside her small window. Her first task was always to light the fire in the big stove, a ritual that felt like waking the house itself. The kitchen, once so cold and forlorn, was now her sanctuary. It was spotless. The copper pots, polished with vinegar and salt, now shone with a warm, rosy light. She had washed the windows, and the morning sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. On the small table where she took her own meals, she had placed a jar of wildflowers she'd gathered from near the creek, and on the corner of the main work table, her mother's recipe box sat. a silent companion. She consulted it daily, her fingers tracing the familiar script. She made simple, hearty food for the ranch hands: biscuits and gravy, chicken and dumplings, thick slabs of pie. The men, who had been subsisting on the rudimentary cooking of one of their own, were quietly ecstatic. They started calling her Miss Tabitha, with a reverence usually reserved for visiting preachers. Royce Hadley remained a shadow. She would hear his boots on the back porch late at night as he came for the plate she left for him. In the morning, she would find the plate washed and stacked neatly by the sink before she was even up. It was the only communication they had, a clean plate left in the pre-dawn quiet. He never spoke to her. If their paths crossed in the yard, he would offer a curt, impersonal nod and keep walking. He was a ghost in his own home, and he seemed to want her to be one too. She learned about him not from his words, but from the quiet observations she made from her kitchen window. She saw the way he gentled a spooked horse, his hands firm but patient. She saw him talking with Jed, his foreman, his expression serious as they looked over a map of the property. She saw the exhaustion in his shoulders when he rode in after a long day, a weariness that seemed to go deeper than just physical labor. He was a man carrying a heavy, invisible burden. One morning, about 3 weeks after her arrival, she went to the wood box beside the stove and found it filled to the brim with neatly split kindling and logs. This was a task she had taken on herself, hauling wood from the pile out back every other day. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the rough bark. He had done it. Sometime in the night or the early morning, he had come in and filled the box, saving her the labor. There was no note, no mention of it. The next morning, the box was full again. It became a new part of their silent ritual. In turn, she began to do something for him. She noticed he always came into the kitchen for a last cup of coffee before riding out to the far pastures, long after the men had finished their breakfast. The pot was often lukewarm by then, so she started keeping it on the warmest part of the stove, wrapped in a tea towel, waiting for the sound of his spurs on the porch. The first time he came in and poured a cup, she watched from the corner of her eye as he took a sip. A flicker of something, surprise, crossed his face before his usual mask of indifference settled back into place. He didn't say a word, but he drank the whole cup, standing by the stove, before he left. It was a strange, quiet language they were developing, a conversation held through deeds, not words, a full wood box, a hot cup of coffee, a mended tear she noticed in his work coat, which she'd quietly stitched one evening while he was out. A loose hinge on the kitchen door that was suddenly, inexplicably, firm and silent. They were two solitary people circling each other in the vast, quiet house, each offering small, anonymous acts of care. She told herself it was just part of the job, part of making her own life more orderly and efficient. But as she laid out a fresh-baked loaf of bread to cool one afternoon, the warm, yeasty smell filling her small kingdom, she knew it was something more. She was putting down roots, whether she'd meant to or not, in the stony, unwelcoming soil of Royce Hadley's ranch. The cohabitation continued its quiet, measured pace for another month. The summer heat baked the land, turning the grasses to a pale gold. Tabitha's life found its groove, a deep and steady one carved by work and routine. The kitchen was no longer just a room in Royce Hadley's house. It was the heart of the ranch's daily life, a place of warmth, order, and the constant, comforting smells of baking bread and simmering stew. The men treated the back door of the kitchen with a kind of reverence, never tracking in mud, their voices automatically lowering as they came to fetch a dipper of water or ask what was for supper. Tabitha, for her part, felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years. She was needed. Her work mattered. The calluses on her hands from scrubbing pots and kneading dough were a testament to that. She still took her meals alone at her small table, the jar of wildflowers always fresh, And every evening, she set out a plate for the master of the house, a man she rarely saw and never spoke to. The silent conversation of small kindnesses deepened. One afternoon, she found a new, sharper axe leaning against the woodpile, a clear improvement on the dull, chipped one she had been using. A few days later, Royce came in from a long ride to find a small bowl of the wild berry cobbler she'd made for the men set aside just for him, next to his plate. He had never instructed her to save him dessert, but when she collected his dishes the next morning, the bowl was empty and washed clean. She began to notice the house beyond her kitchen. She saw the fine layer of dust that still coated the furniture in the front parlor, the way the curtains hung limp and faded in the dining room. She saw the portrait of a smiling, dark-haired woman on the mantelpiece, her face obscured by grime. This was his grief, she understood. It wasn't just in him. It was all around him, in the very dust of the house. One quiet Tuesday, when she knew he and all the men would be gone until dark on a cattle drive, she took a bucket of warm, soapy water and a soft cloth into the dining room. She pulled the dust sheets from the long table and the chairs. She washed the grime from the windows until the afternoon light flooded the room. She polished the dark wood of the table until it shone with a deep, rich luster. She didn't touch anything else. She simply let the light in. When she was done, she put the dust sheets back, exactly as she had found them. It was a secret she kept for herself. The first crack in the rigid structure of their arrangement came not with a sound, but with a smell. It was a day in late September. The weather had turned, a sudden cold snap bringing a wind that howled down from the mountains, carrying the first scent of snow. The sky was a bruised, angry gray. The men were on edge, working to bring in the last of the herd from the high pastures before the storm hit. Royce had been gone since before dawn, riding with them. As the day wore on, the wind grew stronger, rattling the window panes. Tabitha built up the fire in the stove until the kitchen was a cocoon of warmth against the growing storm outside. For supper, she decided against the usual fare. She consulted her mother's box and pulled out a card with faded, looped handwriting. Mama's beef stew for a cold night. It was more than a recipe. It was a memory of her own childhood, of sitting by the fire while a storm raged, feeling safe and warm. It called for carrots, potatoes, onions, and a mix of herbs she'd carefully cultivated in a small patch behind the kitchen, thyme and rosemary. She spent the afternoon chopping and stirring, the rich, savory aroma slowly filling the house. It was a smell of deep comfort, of home. By 6, the stew was ready, thick and fragrant. The men straggled in, cold and weary, their faces chapped by the wind. They ate in grateful silence, the hot stew warming them from the inside out. But Royce did not return with them. Hours passed. The storm broke, and a cold, driving rain began to lash against the house. Tabitha kept the stew warm on the stove. She refilled the coffee pot. She sat at her little table mending a shirt, her ears tuned to the sound of the wind and the rain. It was nearly 10 o'clock when she finally heard the heavy, tired steps on the back porch. The door opened, and Royce Hadley stood there, silhouetted against the dark, stormy night. He was soaked through, his hat dripping water onto the floor, his face pale with exhaustion. He stood for a long moment in the doorway, not moving, just breathing in the warm, fragrant air of the kitchen. His gaze, usually so distant, seemed to fix on something. She expected him to move to the stove, to take the plate she'd prepared and retreat as he always did. But he didn't. He slowly took off his wet hat, his eyes never leaving the kitchen. Then his gaze traveled past her, through the doorway into the hall, toward the dark, silent dining room. He stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then he did something that made Tabitha's heart stop. He turned and walked not to his room, but into the front of the house. She heard a faint rustling sound. He returned a moment later. the white dust sheet that covered the dining table bundled in his arms. He didn't look at her. He walked back out the door and dropped the sheet onto the drenched porch. He came back inside, shutting the door against the storm. He walked to the stove, picked up the plate of stew she had left for him, and a spoon. And then, in a silence broken only by the drumming of the rain, he walked into the dining room and sat down at the head of the long, bare, gleaming table, alone, in the dark. Tabitha stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, a dishcloth clutched in her hand. He ate slowly, methodically, his broad shoulders slumped with weariness. He had not just come in for his supper, he had come home. The wall of silence and sorrow, the wall he had so carefully constructed for 2 long years, had just been breached. Not by a word, but by the simple, warm scent of a beef stew. The next evening, he did it again. He came in from his work, washed his hands at the pump in the kitchen, and took his plate into the dining room, sitting at the head of the table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Tabitha didn't know what to do. The rules of their arrangement had been irrevocably broken, and she had no new ones to follow. She continued her work, her movements quiet and deliberate, acutely aware of his presence in the next room. He was a solid, living man in a house that had long been inhabited only by ghosts. After 3 nights of this new, silent ritual, the tension became a palpable thing in the air between them. On the 4th night, after he had finished his meal and she was clearing the dishes, he didn't immediately rise and leave. He remained seated at the table, turning his empty coffee cup in his hands. The house was quiet. The ranch hands were in the bunkhouse. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the gentle crackle of the fire she had lit in the parlor hearth earlier, an instinctive act to ward off the evening chill. "Miss Lund," he said, his voice low. It was the first time he had spoken her name in weeks. She paused, her back to him. "Mr. Hadley." "Please," he said. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit a moment." Her heart gave a little jump. She slowly dried her hands on her apron, walked around the table, and sat down, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. The great long table stretched between them. He looked down at his hands, then up at her. His gray eyes were no longer flat and empty. They were filled with a deep, shadowed sorrow. "That stew," he began, his voice rough. "The one you made the night of the storm." He paused, swallowing. "My wife, Sarah, she used to make one just like it, with the rosemary." Tabitha said nothing. She simply watched his face, her expression calm and patient. She knew this was a threshold, and her only role was to be still and listen. "This was her table," he continued, running his hand over the polished wood. "She loved this house, filled it with noise, laughter, smells, like your stew." He looked away, toward the dark windows. When she died, the silence. It was too loud. Every room echoed with her not being in it, this table most of all. I couldn't bear to look at it, so I covered it up. I covered all of it up. He gestured vaguely at the rest of the house. "I started eating with the men. I told myself it was practical, but I was just hiding. It was easier to live in the barn than to live in here with her ghost." He finally met her eyes again, and what she saw there was a raw, unguarded vulnerability that stole her breath. "For 2 years, this house has been a tomb. I paid the wages, I ran the ranch, but I wasn't living in it. And then you came, and you started lighting fires, polishing the copper, filling the rooms with the smell of bread. I tried to ignore it." A wry, sad smile touched his lips for a second. "I wasn't very good at it." "And then the stew," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It smelled like she was just in the next room. And for the first time, it didn't hurt. It just felt like coming home. I uncovered the table because it suddenly seemed wrong for it to be hidden. It deserved to have a meal on it again. He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air between them. He had shared the source of his profound grief, the secret that had hollowed him out and kept him a prisoner in his own life. Tabitha felt a wave of compassion so strong it was a physical ache in her chest. She thought of what to say, of the polite condolences one was supposed to offer, but they all felt thin and useless in the face of such a stark and lonely pain. Instead, she leaned forward just slightly. "I am very sorry for your loss, Mr. Hadley," she said, her voice soft but clear. It sounds as though she was a woman who brought a great deal of light to this house. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time not as a cook or an employee, but as a person. He saw the compassion in her steady brown eyes, the quiet strength in the set of her jaw. He saw a woman who knew what loss was, and who met his grief not with pity, but with a simple, profound respect. A long moment passed. "Royce," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "My name is Royce." "Royce," she repeated softly, "and I am Tabitha." The air in the room shifted. They were no longer master and servant. They were a man and a woman, sitting at a table together in a house that was slowly, tentatively, beginning to breathe again. From that night on, everything was different. The unspoken rules that had governed their lives dissolved like sugar in hot water. Royce no longer waited for her to leave his plate on the stove. He came into the kitchen as she was finishing up, his presence filling the space in a way that was no longer intimidating, but grounding. He would wash his hands at the pump, his back to her, and she would be acutely aware of the quiet sounds of him moving about her domain. The first time he spoke to her during this new ritual, it was to say, "Smells good, Tabitha," as he leaned against the doorframe, watching her dish out the evening meal. The simple words, spoken in his low, rumbling voice, made her cheeks flush with warmth. Soon, he began to wait. He would take his plate into the dining room, but he would not start eating. He would sit at the head of the table, his hands resting on either side of his plate, and wait until she had served herself and joined him. The first time it happened, she hesitated in the doorway, her own plate in her hands, unsure. He looked up and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the chair opposite him. She sat, and they ate their meal in a comfortable silence, the vast table no longer feeling like a barrier between them. The silence soon gave way to talk. It started small. He would ask about her day, if she needed anything from town. She would ask about the ranch, about a new foal or the prospect of rain. The conversations were practical, rooted in the soil of their daily lives, but they were a bridge being built, plank by plank, across the chasm that had once separated them. He started telling her stories about the ranch, about the land. He pointed out the window one evening and told her the name of the mountain peak that turned purple at sunset. He told her how his father had homesteaded this valley, building the original cabin with his own two hands, the one that now served as a storage shed. In turn, she found herself telling him about Ohio, about her parents' farm, the scent of the apple orchard in bloom, the specific way the light fell across the fields in late afternoon. She spoke of her mother's garden, and one evening, she brought the wooden recipe box to the table and showed him her mother's handwriting, the faded notes in the margins. He picked up a card for rosewater shortbread and studied it for a long time, his expression thoughtful. "She had a lovely hand," he said quietly. One Saturday, he was heading into Silver Creek for supplies. "Is there anything you require, Tabitha?" he asked, standing by the back door. "Some vanilla, if Mrs. Gable at the Mercantile has it, and perhaps some cinnamon sticks." He nodded. When he returned that evening, he brought her the spices and also a small cloth sack. Mrs. Gable said she got these in from a cellar in California, he said, handing it to her. Inside were 3 perfect, precious lemons. Tabitha gasped. She hadn't tasted a lemon in over a year. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Royce, Thank you." "I figured you'd know what to do with them," he said, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his mouth before he turned away. The house was no longer silent. In the evenings, after the meal was cleared, they would sit in the parlor, a fire crackling in the hearth. She would do her mending, and he would read the newspaper or repair a piece of tack. They didn't always talk, but the quiet was different now. It was a shared quiet, full of comfort and ease. The house felt lived in. It felt like a home. The choosing, when it came, was as quiet and unadorned as everything else between them. It happened on a Tuesday in late October, the leaves of the cottonwoods by the creek turning a brilliant, fiery yellow. They had just finished supper. The meal had been simple: roast chicken, potatoes, and a salad of late-season greens. For dessert, she had used the last of his gift, the lemons, to make a small, perfect lemon tart. He had eaten his slice slowly. His eyes closed for a moment as he savored the taste. When he was done, he pushed his plate away and looked at her, his gaze steady and serious. The firelight from the parlor cast a warm glow on his face, softening the hard lines around his eyes and mouth. "Tabitha," he said. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of a momentous decision. She met his gaze, her hands still on the table. "Royce." "I've been thinking," he said, his eyes not leaving hers, "about this arrangement." Her heart began to beat a little faster. She had been so careful not to want more than this, not to hope for a future beyond the daily rhythm of their shared meals. But hope was a stubborn, wild thing. "The wages are due at the end of the month," he continued, his voice even, "but I find myself reluctant to pay them." A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Was this ending? Had she presumed too much? He must have seen the flicker of alarm in her eyes, because he reached across the table, the first time he had ever done so, and gently covered her hand with his. His hand was large, calloused, and wonderfully warm. "Not because the work isn't worth it," he said quickly, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "It's worth more than I can say. But paying you wages, it feels wrong now. It feels like a lie." He took a breath. "This hasn't been just about the cooking for a long time. Not for me. You didn't just clean my kitchen, Tabitha. You brought my house back to life. You brought me back to life." He slid his other hand across the table, pushing a folded piece of paper toward her. It was thick, official-looking. "I went to see the lawyer in town last week." With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper. It was a deed, the deed to the Hadley Ranch, and at the bottom, where the owner was listed, she saw 2 names, Royce Hadley and Tabitha Lund Hadley. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at her name, written in the lawyer's neat, formal script next to his. Hadley. "I'm not asking you to replace her," Royce said, his voice thick with emotion. "No one ever could. Sarah was my first life. But I find I'd like to have a second one." He squeezed her hand. "I'm asking you to build something new. With me. Here. Not as my cook, but as my partner. As my wife." Tears she hadn't shed in years welled in her eyes, blurring the words on the page. She looked up at him, at this quiet, steady man who had seen her, truly seen her, across a dusty kitchen and a table laden with ghosts. He had not offered her a whirlwind romance or pretty promises. He had offered her half of everything he had. He had offered her a home. She couldn't speak. She simply turned her hand over in his and laced her fingers through his. It was a simple gesture, but it held everything. It was a yes. It was a promise. It was the beginning. And so you see, that is how a woman who arrived in a dusty Nevada town with nothing but a worn valise and her mother's recipe box found her place in the world. It wasn't the place she was looking for, but it was the one that was waiting for her. The love she found with Royce Hadley wasn't a sudden fire. It was a slow, steady warmth, built day by day, gesture by gesture. It was built on full wood boxes and hot coffee kept waiting on the stove. It was built on the courage to clean the dust off old wounds and let the light back in. It was a love built on the shared, quiet understanding that a home is not just a structure of wood and stone, but a place where someone waits for you to come in from the cold. Their story reminds me that sometimes the most profound transformations don't announce themselves with a trumpet's call. They begin quietly, in the heart of a home, with the simple, hopeful act of setting a table for two. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Let me know in the comments what part of this story felt like home to you. Your presence here is a gift, and until we meet again, may you always find warmth when you need it, and may you have the courage to build a life, even in the most unexpected of places.